This is one of the most formidable tank destroyers of World War II, the Jagdpanther. And we're at the world-famous Tank Museum in Bovington, England to find out more. Its story is really about two things: its gun and the evolution of the tank destroyer concept. Tank destroyers, or Jagdpanther in German, resulted from the urgent need to field guns powerful enough to tackle the KV-1 and T-34 after the invasion of Russia, since both Russian tanks not only had better armour, but easily outgunned the Panzer IIIs and IVs of the day. What was needed was a totally new tank, but that would take time. Upgunning existing tanks was possible, but restricted by turret size. So mounting a more powerful gun, but not on a turret, offered more possibilities. Germany had the gun, the Pak-43 like this one. As an anti-tank gun, it was capable of destroying anything on the battlefield at very long range. It was an evolution of the famous 88mm Flak 36. But while it was the same caliber, it was an altogether more powerful gun using a longer and heavier shell. Hitler had wanted it fitted to the Tiger I, but the turret was simply not large enough to take it. It would eventually be fitted to the Tiger II or King Tiger. In the short term, two attempts to field the gun were the Nashorn and the Ferdinand. The Nashorn, which means rhinoceros, was only lightly armoured and had an open fighting compartment, so was far from ideal when it came to slugging it out with the advancing tanks. The Ferdinand mounted the gun on the chassis Porsche had originally designed and built for the Tiger I. There were just 90 of these and they were very unreliable. The gun had a lateral traverse of 22 degrees, and while this doesn't sound very much compared to the 360-degree capability of a turreted tank, remember that 22 degrees of lateral traverse means it can cover a stretch nearly 600 metres wide at 1.5 kilometre range without having to reposition the vehicle. Even at 1,000 metres, it can still cover a 400-metre stretch. So 2 or 3 Jagdpanthers standing off at a range beyond the enemy could effectively cover a major assault front with little risk to themselves except from air attack. The gun fired both armoured piercing and high explosive shells, although the former was its more general round. It fired two types of armour piercing shell: the Panzer Sprenggranate 3943 with a small bursting charge, and the Panzergranate 4043 with a solid tungsten core. This was rarely used as tungsten was in short supply and urgently needed elsewhere. The 39 weighed over 23 kilos and had a velocity of 1,000 metres per second. This meant that it could penetrate over 150 millimetres of sloped armour at a range of 1.5 kilometres. This was more than just about all Allied tanks of the time. Only the IS-2 with 160 millimetres of armour, and then only in the front of the turret, was anything like proof against it. This Jagdpanther is actually a later model, distinguished by the bolted collar. The chassis is pure Panther, with the same Maybach HL230 P30 engine, 7-speed transmission and a torsion bar suspension. Slightly heavier than the Panther itself, the Jagdpanther had a maximum speed of 55 km/h on the road and 46 km/h cross country, virtually identical to the gun tank. But what really distinguishes the Jagdpanther is this very angled frontal armour, sloping back at 35 degrees. Sloping it this way effectively increases the thickness of the armour, which a shell travelling horizontally will have to penetrate, for no additional weight. It was 80mm thick, but thanks to the angle, its effective thickness becomes 140mm, with the added bonus that shells may also be deflected off. The rest of its armour was around 40mm thick, also angled, and in common with German practice at the time, major hull plates were interlocked to add even more strength. The Jagdpanther had a crew of 5 in a compartment that was roomy by the standards of the average tank, and the gun was also offset slightly to allow more space. The driver sat higher than in the Panther tank, no bad thing as he did not have a separate escape hatch. There are 2 hatches on top, one for the commander and one for the loader. The third, kidney-shaped hatch is for the gunner's observation scope. At the rear of the superstructure is a large hatch which could function both as an escape hatch and possibly, more importantly, as a way of getting the gun out for maintenance or repair. We've now moved up to the fighting compartment of the Jagdpanther, and the first thing that's quite obvious to you is the sheer size of it in comparison to that of a tank. Really dominating the fighting compartment is the main armament, which effectively splits it into left and right. If we take each crew position one at a time then, across to the left-hand side and sitting right at the front, you can see the driver's compartment, and the seat actually is missing at the moment. Directly behind the driver sat the gunner. You could see the gunner's backrest there, and you could also see just slightly to the right and forward of him was the traverse handwheel. The elevation handwheel, though slightly outshot at the moment, is just the left-hand side of the main armament. Where I am, if we come back to where I'm sitting at the moment, you can see all the stowage racks behind me. This is where the commander position would be. Across to the right-hand side, and right at the front and to the right was where the radio operator and the stroke bow gunner would actually sit. You can see there quite clearly we've still got the machine gun and machine gun mount fitted. Sitting directly behind him, you'd find the loader's position. You can see then that really the state of the Jagdpanther's fighting compartment is not particularly great and it's got a lot of work, but hopefully with a bit of imagination you can see what it would have looked like back in the day. The Jagdpanther saw action on the Eastern Front, in Normandy and in the last-ditch Ardennes offensive. But although it was superior to almost anything it was up against, there were never enough of them to deliver anything more than local tactical successes. Sheer numbers would always tell. The tank destroyer concept was successful, but not as an alternative to conventional tanks, which could attack and defend through 360 degrees. Both the Russians and the Americans picked it up for similar reasons. The Russians with the SU series, mounting first 85mm guns and then 100mm and 122mm. The Americans produced the M10 and the M18 with 76mm guns and the M36 with a 90mm gun. The Germans produced more tank destroyers and in many sizes since they were easier and cheaper to manufacture than tanks, particularly towards the end of the war when Germany was short of material and largely on the defensive. Of them all, the Jagdpanther was probably the most capable example.